What's up, everybody? Listen, I've been getting this question a lot recently, so I figured I'm going to come on here. I'm going to bring Alexander, somebody that you guys are going to get to know quite a bit over the next couple of months as we lead up to the NFL season. We started talking because I said to him, hey, I get this question all the time on social media, so why don't we get down to the root of it in the numbers and try to come up with an answer to this ambiguous question that I just keep receiving, and that is, how high can Garrett Wilson climb in the Dynasty wide receiver rankings? Now, across most services, Garrett Wilson is currently a top 5 wide receiver. Some places might have him slightly lower than that, but if we're using Keep Trade Cut for a reference, he is right there at number 4, and of course, the top 2 being Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb at 3, then Garrett Wilson at 4, and in this case, they have A.J. Brown at 5. Alexander, this is the first time we've done a show together, but
Yeah.
we'll get into some introductions of kind of your background and stuff in the future on a podcast that we'll be dropping weekly. But let's dive into this a little bit with Garrett Wilson. I think when we look at the top 5 currently, and he's already number 4, is that as high as we can maybe assume that he'll go from here?
I think top 5 is definitely a range that I could find him in. I think obviously situationally he's got a increase in QB play. Been playing with some guys that are pretty below par, and now he's got an QB upgrade with Aaron Rodgers. I think really if you dive into the numbers and looking at some of the situation that he ran into, that kind of hit well on here, and we utilize some like metric aggregations that we kind of fed to a data analysis tool, and kind of was reading through and seeing, okay, who is the top player that we can top 5 players that are most similar to him based on just like his measurables in general and some of his stats throughout the season. And some of the players that kind of pop up is his teammate at Ohio State, Chris Olave, Christian Kirk, who had a pretty good year this year and got a lot of money in free agency last year, which was highly sought after by the Jaguars. And understandably so, he did pretty well last year. And then Tyler Lockett's a big name, obviously. And then for your Seattle fans, Golden Tate. And then, yeah. And so if you just look at his numbers as a player and as a prospect coming in, he definitely delivered with Offensive Rookie of the Year, and his athletic profile definitely gives you some interesting comps to go with. And I think the QB upgrade can definitely allow him to kind of potentially usurp someone like CeeDee Lamb.
So, Alexander, you mentioned that, we went into the system, we ran some analysis in the database that we've put together, and it has 20 plus years of data, very robust information, all the stuff that dynasty gamers and fantasy gamers clamor to get their hands on. And you put in a couple of really interesting input points that we've talked about, and you kind of decided were really important to the intangibles of what makes a great player. Things that we've looked into with like a correlation matrix, where you've looked at, R squared values, what correlates the most to fantasy points per game, which is really important because a lot of guys cite analysis and statistics that really don't correlate, and they come up so often. But you kind of went to the nuts and bolts of this, took a relative athleticism score that you kind of rebuilt and designed in your own way, which is very close to what exists, but just a little different with a little more nuance. And then you looked at a couple other factors. You want to talk about a couple of those that led us to some of these names?
Yeah. So no, I like you said, we kind of created our own little database that outlines all the pieces of information that we find important, and try to, find insights that we may have never seen before. And yeah, we kind of fed into the model, sort of like the basic stuff. I kind of wanted to see what height, weight, hit the RAS score that you mentioned that we kind of created on our own, and sort of some weight adjusted speed. And then also things like receiving EPA, where we saw that there was some sort of increase in correlation between that, and then receiving yards per game, target share, things like that. We fed that into the model, and that's kind of how we came to the conclusion of players like Olave, Kirk, Shepard, and Lockett, which gave really interesting comps for him. And we kind of used, some fun little data analysis tools within there, giving us, sort of a statistical edge in understanding what those metrics kind of work together and how they closely relate to the players that we just saw. So
I think, and I think for people, here's the problem with Dynasty, okay? I'm going to just be straight up and honest with you. People are going to see this list. They're going to love that you mentioned Chris Olave, and they're going to hate that you said Christian Kirk and Sterling Shepard, Tyler Lockett, who, by the way, if that guy was to get 160 targets a season, would have been an absolute god in the NFL. And then Golden Tate, who was great after the catch. The thing about it is, though, there aren't a lot of guys that look like Garrett Wilson, and there aren't a lot of guys to comp on a high-end level for Garrett Wilson. That's kind of where we have to start with this, because people are going to see that list and go, well, who are you omitting from this list? Who didn't you name? And it's like, there's not a lot of other names to throw in here to really juice this up and give you enthusiasm. So we have to look at what he's done and predictively what he could do in the future, and him linking up with Aaron Rodgers seems like that could be a big benefit, because, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron Rodgers, relative to other quarterbacks in the league, has done a lot more for his receivers than many others have. Is that correct?
Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, it goes without saying, right? A 2-time MVP in the last 3 years. He has a huge impact on the receiving core that he works with, especially if he hones in on the specific wide receiver that he loves, with that fits the profile, that kind of what he wants, kind of a do-it-all wide receiver that can be used in all facets of the game. And obviously, since we have a hard time, even though we look at the comps for Wilson, it's a hard time saying, oh, does he really fit into that list? And I think if you think about it, really, Rodgers would love a wide receiver like that kind of fits into that mold. And that's how you can kind of foresee that he'll be funnel targets like that. So.
For sure. And you would run some analysis using some, AI machine learning information within our system. And you would basically asked it, what is Aaron Rodgers, relative to other quarterbacks? And what did you come up with when you got that information?
Yeah, well, definitely. Obviously, everyone, who's a football fan will know that he has a significant impact on his receiving core, just like I said. But, you kind of look at the numbers and just compared to Garrett Wilson, who averaged 12.7 points per game. I mean, the impact would be, we could see through our modeling and analysis, kind of a 4-point increase per game. And if you see that as his baseline, you take in some variance. Aaron Rodgers has an impact of 4 points per game. That would definitely lift him up. You take in at least let's say there's a 3-point standard deviation, then let's say it's 19 for Garrett Wilson with Aaron Rodgers. I mean, that puts him in the top 12 conversation, and obviously for 2022. And so that kind of impact is incredible. And obviously, if people will go back and say, the last year, he really didn't, he had a lot of issues with the team, offensive line. The weapons weren't nearly as great. Nobody like Garrett Wilson, right? And he gets landed into the same situation but with better offensive line play, better defense, and another wide receiver one that kind of fits the mold of what he wants to do with. Obviously, they're not one for one, but kind of within the facets of the game, Davante Adams and Wilson kind of do work in all facets of the field. So you can kind of see that going back to what you said. I mean, 4 points per game has a huge impact, and Wilson was doing 12.71, almost 13 points per game with literally Zach Wilson, Mike White, and Joe Flacco. Imagine what he could do with him, and 19 points per game would put him, up there in the top 12 conversation where he's appropriately going.
Yeah, and to your point, so you brought up Aaron Rodgers and being dead on specific with it. The number that was brought up was 4.16 fantasy points difference for wide receivers that played with Aaron Rodgers versus those when he was not playing, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, and like you're talking about, standard deviation being how much we can fluctuate from essentially the baseline. So if he averaged 13 last year and Aaron Rodgers is perhaps tacking on +4 to this situation, as you mentioned, that puts him up in the 17-point range. That's putting us right in territory with these guys like CeeDee Lamb, like what do we got here? AJ Brown. So you had 6 guys last year that averaged greater than 19.7 fantasy points per game, which is ridiculous. But some of these guys are also getting a little older. Kupp, over 30. Mm-hmm. Davante Adams, obviously over 30. Then you had Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Stephon Diggs. CeeDee Lamb averaged 17.7 points per game. on 156 targets. But what's really interesting, because we brought this question up sort of at the top of the show, was could he potentially climb higher than number 4? Well, it's going to be difficult to climb above Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase for numerous reasons, and we'll probably get into those. But CeeDee Lamb is a very interesting case because we look at last year, yes, there were some injuries to Dak Prescott when, he missed some time, but CeeDee Lamb had no competition amongst the wide receiver group. He had 156 targets. The next closest guy was Noah Brown with 74. So really no competition there. So it's hard to say where CeeDee Lamb goes from here with the addition of Brandon Cooks, with the health of, Michael Gallup, with these other players in place. I'm not saying he's going to change direction at all, but that's where yards per route run changes, right? So yards per route run is one of these metrics, and I gripe to you all the time about people citing it, but yards per route run can be affected by the amount of receivers in a formation, right? Because the more receivers on the field means the less potential opportunity. And that number can also be altered when you add more talent on the field as well, right? More talented guys garnering more target opportunity makes it more difficult as well. So I think there's a universe when we're talking about what we're saying with Aaron Rodgers here that we could, in fact, see a boost enough so that Garrett Wilson climbs into that 17-plus point per game range, all the way up to potentially 19 fantasy points per game with a deviation in there. And I was digging into some of the numbers, and I wanted to talk to you about this. Rarely do we hear people cite specifically wide receiver targets, but we look at Davante Adams while playing with Aaron Rodgers. Over the last 4 years that they played together, which is 2018 to 2021, of all wide receiver targets, we never saw Davante Adams drop less than 40% of the total opportunity. And I don't mean drops like drop the ball. I mean like lose less than 40% of that total yardage opportunity or the target opportunity. Every guy that was the number 2 behind him had a less than 22% target share. So while Davante was seeing 169 targets, Allen Lazard was seeing 60. While Davante Adams was seeing 169 targets, Marquez Valdez-Scantling was seeing 73. Now we go to the Jets, and Garrett Wilson is playing with Aaron Rodgers.
It's tough to do the differentiation, right? It's like the same situation, right?
It feels the same. That's why I'm misspeaking and saying the name because they're a carbon copy. Now, I don't imagine the outcome will be identical.
For sure.
We just saw a guy have a great rookie year, didn't we?
Offensive rookie of the year is pretty good, right? I guess.
Pretty damn good. I mean, it's fairly historical. I mean, we pulled this up. You look at his rookie year usage in 2022, I realize that they played 17 games, but when you sort for all wide receivers that had at least 140 targets, and by the way, per numerous websites, I think he was about 147. There's discrepancy amongst all sites, but if we're using Pro Sports Reference, they had him at 147. That's top 5 all time amongst all wide receivers since 1990. So that list is Terry Glenn, Anquan Bolden, Garrett Wilson, Kelvin Benjamin, Jalen Waddle. That's the list. So pretty impressive first year considering the cavalcade of crap that was throwing him the ball while with the Jets, right? So absolutely. So when we look at this going forward, what things need to sort of play into place? Or can we use Davante Adams as any type of barometer for Garrett Wilson with Aaron Rodgers?
I think you can because, obviously they're not like skill set wise and athleticism. They're kind of two different types of athletes, but they still play in a similar manner where they're utilized all over the field. And their usage really doesn't change. It's just that Davante Adams is also just a freak of nature in his own way, right? Versus Garrett Wilson has his own ability with his speed and his route running prowess. But obviously, I think it's the same situation. You look at it's like a carbon copy. You got Randall Cobb, Allen Lazard on the team. It's 24th all time for Wilson's 64.9 yards per game in his rookie season since 1990. It's just you got to put that into context and say, okay, obviously the team's invested into him too, right? A top 10 pick, right? First round last year. So they're obviously going to cater the offense all around him, especially with the other pieces still kind of trying to figure it out. Alan Lazard and Randall Cobb just came in, and Breece Hall's recovering from an ACL injury. You can envision, him seeing an astronomical amount of targets off the rip from the beginning of the season. given the other weapons within that offense are still either trying to get things figured out or just trying to get on the field.
Yeah, and what's really crazy, and you're totally right. You brought this up, and it's a great stat. You look at what he did, top 24 all time with 64.9 yards per game. That doesn't seem like that much. And we went for an average versus any other number because there's a difference in games played relative to the past. But at the same time, you can make the argument playing a 17th game actually made it a little more difficult to achieve this number because he ran a greater risk of actually having a dud of a game or having a difficult performance, which he did have against a couple of teams last year. But I wanted to bring this up because you and I talked about it. Now, you mentioned the 5 comps at the top, but you and I are aware of one more comp that we would probably consider the 99th percentile comp for Garrett Wilson. Now, before I say this name, would you say that this is like the peak of all potential comps?
I would say so. I mean, yeah, if you're going to be compared to someone like that, yeah, I would say that. Yeah, that's the top tier right there.
So this is the very top. And you mentioned this earlier in the show, or maybe it was pre-show, but it's like a fingerprint in a sense. You're never going to find a guy that's 1 for 1. Nothing is ever 1 for 1. No. Even if we comp a guy and they run, even if a guy benched the same, ran the same, ate the same, slept the same, had the same mom and dad, it doesn't mean their careers will be identical.
For sure.
It does not mean they will be identical. But one thing that you and I really like, and one thing that I appreciate about sort of your style of analytics is what we want to do is look at ranges. We want to look at potential outcomes. We don't want to give you the thumbs up, thumbs down and go, this guy sucks. When in reality, maybe he doesn't suck, but maybe his comps need to be curbed a little bit. Maybe we need to, look a little deeper and go, okay, yeah, maybe he's more of a wide receiver 3 in an offense than this elite asset that we claimed he was going to be in year 1 and then took an absolute crap on him in year 2 because he was no good. With that being said, everybody's like, get to it already. Marvin Harrison, who played with Peyton Manning, would be the elite comp for Garrett Wilson. And what's really interesting is that when you look at year 3, Marvin Harrison, which was year 1 with Peyton Manning, he averaged 64.7 yards per game, which is damn close to Garrett Wilson's 64.9 yards per game. From that point on, from the 4th year in the league, he put up over 1,200 yards for the next 5 seasons and put over 1,100 yards for the next 9 seasons with Peyton Manning. And the question becomes, and we hear this all the time, did a quarterback get better because they got better, or did they get better because better weapons were put around them, like Marvin Harrison, right? So I think when we look at comps, and we talked about earlier, there's not very many. This might be the comp that if we hope he hits the ceiling, we hope he ends up like a guy that has over 100 catches a season and 1,500 yards, right?
You would hope for sure. I mean, it's, you get one, Peyton Manning, Hall of Fame quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, Hall of Fame quarterback. There's just not a lot of situations out there where you can say there's a guy tied to a potential elite quarterback, obviously, so, and I have a hard time kind of believing that, Rodgers, is going to drop off to an extent with the better situation. People like to, comp that he's a little bit more motivated with a new squad being in New York. But yeah, I think, with given that situation, there's not a lot of comps that you can find that situationally of how much of an impact that they would have with this situation. And so it's interesting when you kind of look at his size, speed, him as a player overall. Obviously, Harrison didn't hit with Peyton until Peyton came in year 4. But obviously that kind of takes some time. So I think the ceiling's through the roof for him. But obviously you got to kind of look at it in sort of ranges, right? At baseline, maybe he's just stays the same and he's a 13 point per game and the team regresses, but you kind of have to get a snapshot of what the situation could be, right? And then allow yourself to make an informed decision based off of the information you're given, and at least narrows the window down for you to be able to understand. And that's sort of what we're doing is, looking at that data and giving us a snapshot of what's actually going on.
I think, once we factor in the quality of target change and how important that can be, that can make a major difference. And one thing that you and I talked about pre-show, and at least kind of in my mind, is what I saw from Aaron Rodgers over the last 3 years was really unique. There was a failed system in 2022, but 2021 and 2020, he was the MVP of the league. Had almost, in 2020, over 70% completion percentage. Was the first time in his career since 2007. Then in 2021, 68.9% completion percentage, the second best completion percentage of his career since, again, 2007. So we started to see a different version of him, which really reminded me of what we saw from Drew Brees over the last 5 years of his career prior to sort of the end of it. He became a lesser volume passer overall, still in the, the 500 to high 400 range, but he had an over 70% completion percentage for his final 5 seasons from age 37 to 41. I mean, he had a 74% completion percentage for 2 consecutive seasons, one of the most accurate passers in football. So if that is the trajectory for Rodgers, then we're still getting a guy that's in his passing prime. He may not bomb it downfield play after play after play, despite the fact that last year he was number 2 overall in deep balls. So
he was top 5 in deep ball targets. So yeah,
he was top 5 in deep balls. So, or top 2 overall. So with 81, number 9 overall in air yards. So we certainly can't write that off. And one thing that we should mention about air yards too, a lot of people picture air yards and just assume it's you throwing downfield. You could throw 5 yards a pass, 1,000 passes, and still have a massive volume of air yards. Or you can be a guy that throws 500 balls, 70 yards downfield, right? So air yards are relative to opportunity or distance. But still, top 10 passer in attempts, top 2 in deep ball. So we can't write that off. Efficiency goes up, deep ball opportunity goes up, competition did not go up, quarterback play goes up. So I believe, and I think you do too, if we can comfortably say that he gets 2 to 3 years of Aaron Rodgers versus CeeDee Lamb, it becomes an interesting conversation because people are going to use recency bias for Lamb in a very empty wide receiver room, but also they're going to look at Dak Prescott, who I'm a fan of, and I'm sure you like as well, but he's 31? So there's a very big difference in quarterback opportunity here. I just think I wouldn't turn my back on the idea, and you had brought this up at the top of the show. I wouldn't turn my back on the idea that come week 11, week 13 this year, people are ranking Garrett Wilson ahead of CeeDee Lamb. I don't think that that's a crazy thought at all.
No,
right?
It definitely can happen, especially, again, like I said, if the situation is that Brees doesn't come back in week 1 or they ease him in, and then the rest of those guys are just trying to ease into the whole offense as a whole, I mean, I feel like they just cater the entire offense around Rodgers and Wilson until those other guys get into the mold. And then let's say we're halfway through the season and people are starting to have that conversation. Is CeeDee Lamb the 3 or should it be Garrett Wilson?
100%. And, I'm digging a little deeper into this. What's really interesting, going back to that Drew Brees comp, when the Saints were number 23 in the league in pass attempts and Drew Brees had only thrown 489 passes, Michael Thomas still saw 147 targets for 125 catches and 1,400 yards. So it's not going away. Like, if you're going to look at Aaron Rodgers' career, especially the last 3 years, and think that 2022 is representative of what we've seen as an aggregate over the past 3, you're insane. You cannot take 2022 and act like it means anything.
Well, just the investment that the Jets put into, right?
Sure.
Into drafting him, right? I think like kind of the NFL teams also sometimes they're off, but I feel like they're pretty close on when to, sunset some of these guys. And obviously the Green Bay traded him, but they only traded him because they were just it was a bitter relationship, sort of a divorce situation. And I'd say that the Jets were willing to, break the bank to try to get somebody that could get them wins. And I feel like that's kind of evident. Obviously there's no data backing behind that, but from their confidence, I think that they think that he could be their guy, obviously.
Sure. And even the Lazard, for the people that are bringing up Lazard, I think a lot of these pieces are, again, these are guys that familiarity, staring at a wide receiver room and going, no, not these guys, not them. I don't know these guys. So it doesn't do anything to deter me from how I feel about Garrett Wilson going forward. And again, even Rodgers last year, while people want to take, again, dumps on him, accuracy rating top 12 in the league. So a top 12 accuracy rating, a top 10 in pass attempts, top 2 in deep balls, had no wide receivers, by the way, no wide receivers. And when I mentioned earlier how Davante Adams, while with Aaron Rodgers, never had less than 40% of the wide receiver targets. The year that he wasn't there last year, Allen Lazard only had 31% of those targets. And then behind him was Romeo Doubs with 21%. So a difference of 10% between these two guys, while Davante Adams was burying wide receivers. So I think that, right, that goes to show, like, I think the confidence in Rodgers and the versatility in the weapons.
Well, and just also, I mean, he played 15 games last year with Rodgers, right? And he only eclipsed 788 yards. You mean, you referenced the target share as well, and he had if Lazard was supposed to be the guy and everyone was buying into the preseason hype of Rodgers, hyping up Lazard, his best deal when he had the receiving room to an extent by himself for most of the season, 788 is the best number. And then you kind of go back to the same situation where you've got a receiver now that has a year under his belt, kind of got an understanding, offensive rookie of the year, kind of played a ton of games. The sky's the limit for sure.
So one last question.
All right.
And we don't have to get crazy with this one. This is a whole nother thing, and this would be a hard argument to make. Do you see a world where Aaron Rodgers isn't with the Jets that you would ever try to make an argument that he should climb up into the tier with Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase?
I think the only conversation would be I feel like Chase, and then people reference this a lot. I think obviously when these guys are playing, it's playing as a team, right? And sometimes the whole situation is like, a perfect storm for players to be good. I think in the vacuum, Jefferson is an elite player, obviously. But if, let's say, he gets a downgrade and Kirk Cousins is not there, or they get a rookie quarterback that may not be that great. I mean, you can envision a scenario where if Rodgers is still in the league and Cousins is on another team and they have a rookie quarterback, there's a potential that he could enter that conversation, especially, or people just have that conversation, right? It just gets brought up because, people jump to conclusions. So
yeah. And to defend your take, while we're not saying that Garrett Wilson will ever be ranked in the Jefferson tier, there is a universe where for the next 2 years with Aaron Rodgers, Garrett Wilson puts up 1,500, 1,600 receiving yards. Justin Jefferson with Jordan Addison and Kirk Cousins maybe looking a little different, comes back down to earth a little bit to 1,750, 1,700, and suddenly they're separated by 100 yards. And then one day Jefferson loses Kirk. And then you're looking at these two players and you're like, well, is it a coin toss? Are they both right? That's how you get closer together, I think. But the difference being Jefferson has proved to be absolutely elite for 3 consecutive years. So for now, a really hard conversation to have. Total tripwire. I think you handled it well. Jamar Chase, obviously, averaged 11.2 targets per game. If he gets a full season's worth of targets, he's going God mode. Justin Jefferson's really unstoppable. But I think it's hard to make an argument that Garrett Wilson won't be the wide receiver 3 overall in fantasy towards the end of the year, only to get leapfrogged by the son of our comp for him, Marvin Harrison Jr., where he would then be. Go ahead.
The moment he walks, the moment draft season starts, he's the wide receiver. Yeah, he'll jump in that top 5 conversation immediately. Yeah, obviously. The hype around him is just the same around as Bijan. He's just one of those kind of, 101 type players. So yeah, he'll jump in that conversation, and then it'll be Marvin Harrison versus, his son doing the Spider-Man meme, maybe.
Love it, man. Love it. Well, all the way to the top. All right, everybody. Obviously, if you like the content, hit the like button, hit subscribe. Comment down below if you think we're absolutely insane to be considering Garrett Wilson going up to number 3. What are your thoughts on CeeDee Lamb? I'm curious what people think because, again, CeeDee Lamb had a fantastic year. I'm a huge fan of CeeDee Lamb based on what he had done in his prior 2 years, multiple years in the league. But you look at the wide receiver group around him, you could start to make an argument. Maybe things look a little different this season. So tell us what you think in the comments down below. And starting next week, Alexander and I will be doing a full-time podcast, probably hour to an hour and a half long, looking at deep analytics on particular players going on, with a lot of the subject matter that's going on right now. We've got a lot of players that we want to talk about, a lot of dichotomies, which I think is one of the best ways to play fantasy football, is to take 2 players and A/B their situations and really kind of get down to the granular point of view. we've got a lot of deep advanced metrics that we didn't even crack the seal on. I mean, this was us with the volume turned up at like 4. So we're going to go much, much louder in the future. So thank you to everybody for checking this out. Look for our show. Drops next week. We'll see you then.